All right, appreciate everyone's time this morning. And again, thanks so much for joining us. My name is Daniela Perry. I serve as the Vice President of the Georgia Chamber Foundation, and we're really excited to talk with some of our experts on what happened in the 2024 legislative session and how this impacts workforce development. So first, a big thanks to our anchor investors. If you see any of these organizations or work with them, thank them for their investment in workforce development in Metro Atlanta. We really couldn't do it without our anchor investors. We're really excited to be joined again by Cosby Johnson with the Georgia Chamber of Commerce and Tim Cairl with the Metro Atlanta Chamber of Commerce to talk through some highlights of the 2024 legislative session. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to y'all. But Tim, would love for you just to kick off and share just a little bit about yourself and the Metro Atlanta Chamber and kind of some of the big priorities that y'all were watching this year.
Great. Thanks, Daniela. Good morning, everybody. I'm Tim Cairl. I'm Senior Director for Talent Development at the Metro Atlanta Chamber. I oversee our education and talent policy and programs. We had a lot of things we were watching, and a couple we were really excited about. Everything from what we saw in the early ed and pre-K space, which, as everybody on this call knows, is an important part of workforce, and all the way through a lot of exciting things happening, particularly with the college and career connections for both high school and post-secondary around high demand career initiative, some slight modifications to the Hope Scholarship, which I find actually quite exciting since that was a surprise for this year. And then some things that didn't pass. And I'll be happy to walk through more of those, but glad to be with y'all this morning.
Thanks, Tim. Cosby?
First off, hey everybody, thanks for jumping on as always. My name is Cosby Johnson. I am in the Government Affairs Department for the Georgia Chamber of Commerce, but also run their coastal regional office, working with several partners down in the southeastern part of our state to ensure that they're plugged in on all the great things that we're doing as a statewide chamber. I probably just follow up with what Tim said, right? A lot of things that we were interested in coming into the space. We were working in several different spaces as we thought about kind of talent and workforce development. I think Tim brought up the high demand career space, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but I'm glad to see some movement in that space, but also touching spaces like legal reform and occupational reform to ensure people have a pathway back to work when they stumble. We understand people stumble at all kinds of ages. So ensuring that we have a clear pathway for them back into the workforce is something that's important to us, as well as occupational licenses around military spouses and those moving in. I think not only the things that we've seen pre-K, K-12 space was really interesting, but also the work around kind of the non-traditional talent that we have throughout the state. So really excited and happy to be with you all this morning.
I think that was super helpful and just appreciate what both of y'all do. Because living and breathing the Capitol for 40 legislative days is no small feat. So appreciate y'all for keeping it all together and making it look easy breezy. So I know y'all kind of highlighted some of those big areas, early learning, thinking about like second chance hiring options, occupational licensing reform. Cosby, I wanted to know if you could kind of touch on those specific bills that I know the Georgia Chamber advocated for, and I know oftentimes we work with the Metro Atlanta Chamber, but we also get to divide and conquer to make sure we've got lots of hands on the ground to get it all done because there's so much to cover. But Cosby, I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about some of those specific bills that the Georgia Chamber really pushed and advocated hard for in the K-12 workforce space.
For sure, for sure. The first one, I want to leave the deeply education ones to Tim because I know he can knock those out of the ballpark, and I know we're a good tag team here. It's like Shaq and Kobe right now. But I think the one that was really important to us that we saw a lot of, I think a lot of support around was House Bill 880. And House Bill 880 from Bethany Ballard was an issue that was pushed by our hub chamber commission. And our hub chamber kind of came together, all of our kind of will and spoke cities, a lot of them either adjacent or had a base inside of their footprint. And they really came to us and said, listen, we've been working for a long time on occupational licensing reciprocity when military spouses move into the state, ensuring that families can kind of get back to work and get back to a sense of normalcy. As we know, the person who is in the military comes into our state with a job, and they are already back to work. But you have whether it is a husband or a wife, extremely difficult for them to move from, let's say, Oklahoma and immediately re-engage in their engineering job, immediately re-engage in their teaching job, immediately re-engage in doing hair and cutting some hair. I mean, and so I think it was something that was important to our hub chambers, because they had heard over time that we were scoring 0 points from the Department of Defense in that area. And it's important for us to gather those points, because as they think about moving missions and moving bases, which obviously affects different parts of Georgia, it was important for us to ensure that we got as many points from that section as we could. And House Bill 880 does just that. It allows people with good standing in other states to move into the state and have that immediate reciprocity while they are seeking their license here in Georgia. So we were happy to get that across the board. And that was really important to us, because we know how important it is to our military communities. I think one of the bills that we watched and that we were highly supportive of that didn't pass, and I know Tim talked about some that didn't pass, was House Bill 1124, which was the last mile grant extension. I think all of the work that many groups around the state had done to ensure that we have the last mile grant written in a way that could really touch non-traditional students in those TCSG spaces. And Chuck Martin did a great job moving the bill forward. I think this is an idea that has a lot of support to ensure that it's not just set up for your traditional USG students who have that 80% completion time, but it's also set up for those who really aren't in those traditional programs, for them to have that additional help after they've completed a certain amount of hours, that this grant could be used for regular life situations. If you're struggling with rent, if you're struggling with childcare, all of those things that knock you off in that last mile of completion, those are things that were really important to us to get across the finish line. While we didn't see that piece of legislation pass, I believe it's something that has legs. It has complete support of the workforce development community, and I think the business community as well. And I'm sure it's something that Chairman Martin isn't going to let go. So that's something that we're going to watch as we continue to work in this space.
Thanks, Cosby. I think that was so helpful. And it really was HB 880 was so important to so many of our communities across the state, and was signed by the governor on Wednesday. So we're really excited. We're in the governor's veto period. By May 7th, the governor has to decide to sign or veto or not touch it. And then it automatically becomes law, I believe. So in a fun period where lots of things are getting signed. But Tim, would love for you to kind of share too about some of those specific bills that the Metro Atlanta Chamber really dug in on and championed.
Great. Thanks, Daniela. If you don't mind, I like to say, we create these PowerPoint decks to show everybody, what we're talking about. But in reality, it's kind of our notes page. It's how presenters sort of keep track of what we're going through. So if you don't mind, I'll share my screen and just move through some of these as quickly as possible. But I did want to just kind of recap a little bit as far as kind of things that we talked about at the beginning. Let me just advance the slides here. So in case, I'm sure many on this call already know, but just the setup of what our legislature is, that there is a one-party control of governor and the both chambers. And there's a little bit of divide on that. Our House Speaker is John Burns, and our Senate President is Lieutenant Governor Burt Jones. These are some things we talked about at the beginning, back in, I think it was December, maybe, Daniela, when we did our preview. A big one that we talked about then was the ability for our workforce boards to meet and vote over teleconference or video. So that did pass. That was actually early in the session, a nice little sort of shot across the bow in a good way. Some other things we talked about then, one that didn't make it and was so close, similar to the college completion bill Cosby talked about, was the second chances fix. This is Senate Bill 157, which was a slight tweak of the big second chances bill that happened a couple of years ago, and it just kind of sat the last day waiting for one last little vote, and it just didn't happen. The school choice or school vouchers bill did pass. There's a lot of add-ons to that bill, and I'll touch on a couple of those in just a second. Truck weights, which we thought would be back, was the log jam from last session that kind of slowed a lot of things down. That did not come back. But certificate of need, or CON, did pass, and there's also some rural hospital implications for that. So there's some interesting things with that bill. Not my area of expertise, just want to point that out. On the pre-K expansion side, particularly for any parents of young children, this is a big deal. We weren't really sure from the study committee that happened last year under Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones what all was going to come out of that. But here's some of the things that happened around that. There's startup funding, salary parity. There's a lot of good things. The transportation was a nice surprise, that there was additional monies and operations in there for that. Parental leave was another one, also led by Pro Tem Jones. That was a nice surprise. That extends parental leave for state employees from 3 to 6 weeks. There was an apprenticeship expansion. This we were actually excited about this one last year that put in, I believe it was 100 specific grant programs for employers, mostly of small and medium-sized businesses, to offer apprenticeships, and there's some financial incentives for them to do that. This expanded the total number of those programs and also offers the money a little earlier to those businesses. So we're very excited to see that one happening. In the legislature, year to year, the folks on this call, along with a lot of partners, have things that we push year to year to year, and we're never really sure if it's going to come to fruition. This next one around high demand career was one I think many on this call and probably some of the attendees have been rolling that ball up the hill and not sure if we were ever going to get there, and it happened this year. So this comes about. I'm not going to go into the super specifics because a lot of it is TBD. But what I would say is a lot of this stemmed from a little bit of confusion on where the high demand career initiative, where the list of occupations exactly belonged, and how it was assembled, and how things get on and off a list. So it had been a question, particularly on the business side, for many years, and even somewhat on the school side. So it was nice to see that happen, that there's some clarity. There's a point of reference now with the state workforce board. Lots more to come on that over the next year, but it's very exciting to see that that is moving and that there's becoming some tighter definition and scope around that program. So kudos to the many folks that have been lifting that for many, many years. Also included in that, working on many, many years, is transfers. This is both from our 2 to 4 year and 4 year to 2 year, that there were some guardrails or guidelines put around that process, and some reporting requirements that were put in place. Again, this is another one where there's been kind of a big question mark, particularly for students who are getting caught in that credit transfer between our institutions. The next one was a big surprise. This sort of happened right at the end of session, and it flew through on the last couple days. So what this is when you have a student who is receiving Hope Scholarship and they complete their 4-year degree ahead of time, the Hope credits that they basically have banked still that they have not used, they can transfer to a graduate degree, and I'm probably going to get some of the specifics on this wrong, so bear with me. This is new. So when they transfer to a graduate degree, they can use those Hope credits at the undergraduate payment schedule or tuition schedule for Hope for that graduate education until those credits are exhausted. So if you think about a student who has really worked hard to graduate early, and on, or sorry, before on time even. So they're getting out of college sometimes at a 3 or 3.5 year rate. They would still have some of those credits available. They can now use those for graduate school at the undergraduate tuition rate. We did see some additional money for CAPS, which is our child care subsidy program. It was not quite enough to cover the loophole or the funding hole that is resulted as a pullback from some of the COVID spend relief. But it was nice to see that there's at least some additional money being put into that program. And then, of course, a whole bunch of study committees. This is everything from the affordability of childcare, that'll be on the Senate side. And then we also have some around maternal and infant health. I'm almost done, I promise. Some other new items. There's a driver's license retention bill. This is a big one, and that's kind of second chances and working on barriers to workforce. This will give better definition and some expansion around the waiver for the driver's license reinstatement fee, which is a big deal for people that need to get their driver's license and go to work while they're waiting for other things to happen. So this is that was a nice thing to see happen. Accelerated Career Diploma Program. This one's kind of near and dear to my heart. This sort of puts a name and definition around you have a traditional diploma program that students go through K-12. When you have things like dual enrollment, you have those early credits that are happening. You have the aligned to industry pathways that are happening in K-12. This gives a definition to all of those things around accelerated career. Not an expert on this one, but I am very excited. There's now kind of some definition and some guidelines or guidelights around what that other career option is for students that really want to either move into workforce quickly after high school, or even while they're in high school, and just sort of gives options for what students can do while they're in college, just to get moving ahead on the career plans. Another surprise was the child tax deduction increase from $3,000 to $4,000. That was Speaker John Burns' initiative that we're really excited to see. Last things, these are my maybe next year's. Expansion of our computer science in K-12, online mobile sports betting. There's a lot of stuff here. The one that I was kind of surprised didn't make it was the eliminating sales tax on diapers. I thought that was actually kind of a cool thing when you think about some of the costs that hit parents, particularly working parents, that are sort of struggling on that childcare side. I thought that would have been a really nice thing to have. Maybe next year. We are always talking about school counseling and the need there to increase those numbers and bring that ratio down. And then, of course, we'll be back on college completion grants and occupational licensing next year. That was really it.
Well, I think y'all both have highlighted it was a big year for education workforce stuff, but I think there were a lot of things that we still are really looking forward to. I know college and career counseling is one that we've been working on. We had a scorecard position with the Georgia Chamber for 982 as well, and for 157, just because of the huge opportunities and the individuals that are really getting left out of the workforce, and they don't have all those opportunities. And of course, as we continue to see workforce shortages and skills mismatch, we want all opportunities on the table, and we don't need more barriers to prevent folks from being able to engage. So, I know there are always, things that kind of end up sucking the air out of the room that you aren't expecting. And then of course, some that you are. What would y'all say I know, Tim, you kind of talked a little bit about it, but some of those big issues in terms of that weren't education related, but are important for people to be aware of what's happening in the state. Any issues that people kind of need to be aware of things that were important for this legislative session?
Yeah, I think the immediate ones that I think about is obviously healthcare, right? Healthcare touches a broad swath of individuals across our state and are completely important, not only for our families, but also for our teachers and those entering the workforce. While we've seen CON pass, it was a truncated version of CON that completely focused on the rural areas around our state. And we understood that from those pushing it kind of from the Senate side, we understood that that was their focus from the beginning. Inside of that bill, though, there are a couple things that are important as a whole. One is the rural hospital tax credit, which changes the amount of private dollars that can be given to smaller rural hospitals. And that's incredibly important for those hospitals funding across the state. But also inside of that bill, which is extremely important to us, is a study committee on healthcare expansion. We can say it a million different ways. We can call it Medicaid expansion. We can call it a Georgia-focused solution or whatever it is. But what, at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is repatriating Georgia's tax dollars back into the state for healthcare. All of us know that those are dollars that we are sending to the federal government that don't come home. We have had several iterations of waivers kind of go through. We haven't until now gotten a waiver through, but we think that there are some states around the country who have a model that may be able to pass, and we can create our own Georgia option. And so that study committee inside of that bill is something I know we will be watching extremely seriously as they move throughout it, because we want to make sure the Georgia option makes sense, and we want to make sure we get something done to bring those dollars home. The other piece of, larger legislation that you just may have heard of on the periphery is the film tax credit. And the reason I talk about that is because that is obviously a growing job sector, a job sector that has found itself growing not only in the state, but also into some of our programming and some of our colleges and technical schools and others. As we followed the film tax credit throughout, there were several different thoughts of what could happen. There is obviously a more hawkish Senate side that sees itself as, I think, more fiscally responsible or thoughtful than the other side. And because of that, they put in this bill that allowed them to evaluate tax credits each and every year. And upon evaluating those tax credits, they have the ability to amend or change or do what they need to do to the tax credits. The film tax credit is something that has been studied probably for about 2-3 years now in a row, different kind of studies floating around. And this sounded like the year that they planned on coming with some kind of change to that tax credit. At the end of the day, once that we had seen a version from the House and once we had seen a version from the Senate, it ended up that nothing happened. So there was no change to the tax credit. But the reason I bring the tax credit up is because I do believe this is an issue that we will continue to see throughout sessions. There is a faction of the House and there's a faction of the Senate that is pretty large that want to see this tax credit amended in some kind of way. And what that way is, we're not sure, where they can build consensus around it. But what I do believe is that this is an issue that we will see year to year. And the last two that, I'll focus on really quick, which were, I think something that really the Georgia Chamber thought was a good idea. We hope that the fight is continued, which is House Bill 941 and Senate Bill 360, which has to do with pre-K program funding. Really, the bills allow capital outlay funds to be used for educational facilities, for voluntary pre-kindergarten programs, provided by the school system, while also making permissible the availability to include pre-K numbers into the student count projections. Those two things are extremely important for us, as we know pre-K is something that we want to expand here in Georgia and be at full capacity. Communities being able to use capital outlay funds for that, but also to be able to change the count for that, to look into it, is extremely important to us. So there was a House version and a Senate version. This is, again, Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones's baby. While we had both of those, neither one of them passed, but we will continue to fight for those through other sessions.
Cosby and Tim both know that I have a very young child, and so the pre-K is always at the top of my list because it's so important we invest in our earliest learners. I think like 90% of their brain is developed in the first 2 years. So we can't, really think about preparedness if we're not thinking about those investments in early learning. The only one thing too, Cosby, I would add, since I spent too much time on this past year, is housing. We had a couple bills that we're working on because we know we just don't have, the inventory in the kind of workforce middle income slots to really meet our needs. So we're going to keep fighting the good fight. Cosby was integral in helping us continue those discussions at the Capitol, but we'll kind of continue some of that in the off season. Because we've got to always have something to do and fix. So Tim, what else did y'all kind of watch that may have not been workforce specific, but certainly is important to this community?
Yeah, there were a few things I think that came up particularly towards the end of session. Not certainly anything that I was working on, but just watching sort of what's taking up time and what's taking up a lot of debate. There was an immigration bill that went through. There was also an elections bill that went through. Those took up a good bit of legislators' time and focus. So I would say there's always things like that that come up, particularly when they happen at the end of session, can be a little bit of consternation for those of us that are working on other issues. It doesn't mean that they're not important, that our issues aren't important. It's just all about timing because we're under such a time constraint for when and how things need to get done. And then you have that sort of raucous practice of how one chamber will slightly change a bill, and then it has to go back to the other chamber to agree, and then that chamber will change the bill yet again, and then it goes back and forth. And so there's kind of this sort of volley that happens with bills at the end of session, where we saw things like at Senate Bill 157 or 157. Yeah, so when we see some of these bills that just sort of get caught in that, and the college completion grant kind of getting caught in that same process as well, where there's just not enough time to do committees and things like that. So I don't want to make us sound, for those of you who aren't deeply involved in the legislature, it's not that things are not happening. There is definitely a lot of stuff happening. It's much more on what the prioritization of those things and how much time legislators have to get things done that tends to be a little bit of a problem towards the end.
No, I think that's a great point, Tim. I think that we've got another colleague of ours that kind of talks about this presentation and kind of what's going on. But I think there's like more than 2,000 bills that were introduced this legislation, another like 2,500 resolutions. I think around 800 or so actually did pass. So there are lots of things that are happening, but it's always kind of going back and forth of figuring out what's happening here, and stuff gets added and changed. So I would say it's that kind of ends up being a lot of how we spend the next couple of months, is figuring out where everything got, and then of course what the governor decides to do with pieces of legislation and bills. So always something to do, always something to be excited, but certainly you can always reach out to our team if you've kind of got questions or if you're seeing. But I think that's kind of what we all get together and kind of spend some time figuring out what actually did happen and what didn't. So kind of yes.
And I was going to say, I think Tim hit on something really good, is that last day, things tend to eat up a lot of legislative time, especially in the second year of a biennial, right? And so for us, we have a 2-year legislative session. And in that 2-year legislative session, you have 2 years to pass the bill that you introduce. And after that second year, all the bills are wiped from the table, and we go back to House Bill 1 and Senate Bill 1. And so really, what you're seeing in the second year of a biennial, which is what we were in this year, is a lot of people trying to really get that bill across the line. And really get it done. Not only because it's the second year of a biennial, but I'm sure everyone sees those yard signs, and you know it is election time. And so there's a ton of bills that are important, I think, for both of the political parties to either get passed or fight. But also being the second year of that biennial, a lot of people want to make sure that they don't have to kind of start back at the finish line, because in the middle, um, say between the years, if you drop a bill and you pass that bill out of the House and you get it to the Senate, or you pass that bill out of the Senate and you get it to the House, it stays there. So it stays in the body that it had gotten to. However, when you start back from the beginning, it goes all the way back.
And I think that's a great point, because really, coming from last year to this year, you've got some stuff that's already in place. You can move it a lot quicker. Procedurally, things are already in one committee or another, and so it gets a lot easier to move through. And so next year we're starting off from scratch. So, I would love for y'all to kind of talk about what this off season kind of looks like, knowing that it was different from last year and that we do have elections. So every member of the House, Senate is up for re-election. Of course, presidential elections are going on, congressional. But kind of what are y'all thinking about for this off season of what this looks like? And of course, kind of what some implications of having the election this year might look like long term.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, I think, Danielle, about with the study committees that happen in an election year. It's always interesting to see like what will or won't come out of those. So similar to how the pre-K study committee last year actually produced some pretty significant legislation. I'll be curious if the Senate study committee on childcare has that same effect, particularly as we go into a new legislative session next year with some new legislators. So we did have some retirements or people, getting appointed to different positions or moving off of the legislature. So there'll be some new legislators coming in next year. That'll be interesting to see how that plays in as well. Um, yeah, so that's pretty much it. I'm always curious about these study committees that happen in an election year and how ambitious they get. Well, a lot of the signal for me usually is how quickly they get to work in holding those meetings, particularly ahead of the election. Because once the election kind of 30-day window gets here, when people are early voting and everything, it's kind of hard to do those types of meetings, particularly as these reps and senators are having to run for re-election. So it'll be fascinating to watch how all that unfolds throughout the year. But of course, I know the folks on this call and some of our attendees will be participating in those, or at least attending the study committee. So a lot of off work that happens. And I should also point out that at the end of this year, the legislators will all be gathering in Athens for the biennial hosted by the Carl Vinson Institute at UGA. That is, for lack of a better word, it's when legislators get trained on their craft. A lot of them are learning about how the state budget works for the first time, and sort of all those things that our new representatives and senators need to learn before they walk into session. So that'll be happening at the end of this year as well.
Yeah, and I think too, to Tim, your point, a lot of these folks are finally getting back to their actual job on a day-to-day basis. Being in the legislature is not a moneymaker, so they're catching up on, the first quarter of work, getting back to their families, and also running for re-election, and then also doing a lot of this activity. So it's not for the faint of heart. They're working really hard, and we appreciate everything that they are doing. And I think certainly too, as we think about, childcare will certainly be a priority too, especially with, Representative Lauren Daniel, her tax credit going from 3,000 to 4,000. I think everyone understands the pressure that working families are under, and that childcare costs have grown, which is good because we appreciate everything that our childcare workers do on a day-to-day basis. And Irene had a question too about the pre-K capital outlay funds that did get added into SB 233. So thank you, Irene, for mentioning that one. So excited. Again, all this kind of changes at the last minute, but really excited to see that focus on early learning. Cosby, would love your thoughts too here on kind of what this looks like, what we're thinking about. I know too, some of our issues from the Georgia Chamber perspective, we're thinking about tort reform and how do we make sure that small businesses have manageable operational expenses, but kind of what are y'all thinking from a big picture perspective about what this off season looks like?
Yeah, I would echo what Tim is saying, honestly, which is it is hard to try and find out what people will do during an election year. That takes all of the oxygen kind of out of the room. And we understand that people are running for their office and running to come back and have a voice in the process, but also, we have much larger elections going on that shape kind of the climate and policies around the state of Georgia. So I think we will, in the most part, be watching kind of the election cycle, knowing that turnover in the state house and the state senate has been pretty volatile over the past 4 years. So it has a lot to do with us getting in and educating those on the issues that we've already done some work on and bringing them up to speed on things that are important to the business community. So we'll be doing that. We've involved ourselves in some primaries where we see it makes sense. So the election landscape is always something that we're watching as well. When you say tort reform, I think it is something that the Georgia Chamber fights for year after year after year. This year we saw a couple of wins. And those wins were, important to the whole, especially our trucking industry. We had a big win with our trucking industry as far as being able to sue the insurance companies directly. And that was a bill that we were happy to get done with, both the House and the Senate supporting it and the governor signing it. So that's something that's important to us. However, we do understand that there are larger issues in the tort reform space that we still have to continue to work on, such as premises liability. It is something that has been important to us at the Georgia Chamber for a long time. We see this as a space that truly protects small business, but also businesses across the state. Because when businesses do all that they can to keep those who are using their facility safe, and when they are acting in good faith, some of the judgments that we've seen really can cripple not only larger businesses, but smaller businesses in that space. So I know that is something that not only myself, but Nancy and Rayner and the entire team will be talking about throughout this off season. And the other one that I really want to continue to bring up is, what we do with healthcare. I think that is something that will be worked on during the off season. I think there is an appetite from leadership on all sides to do something in the healthcare space. And I hope that study committee kind of gets its legs and gets moving. I know there is a lot of healthcare partners involved in it that will be involved. And so we'll be watching closely to see how we can be supportive in that space.
Absolutely. So I think we've kind of talked about it a little directly, but want to make sure we kind of really touch this. I think there was a lot of conversations, a lot of study committees last year leading up to this session about workforce, right? The Senate had a committee. There was the Senate Committee on Trucking Workforce. There was occupational licensing reform in the Senate. The Secretary of State has his occupational licensing conversation. Of course, we had Speaker Pro Tem Jan Jones, all of her early learning work. And so it kind of contributed to a lot of hype about workforce this session of like, we're really going to have a busy session. And I think we certainly did, but I was curious about y'all's kind of take on that. And then if y'all expect this to continue to next year. I know we've had some things are always a little different in an election year, but, do y'all think the legislature has really keyed in on the fact that we've got some big opportunities in the state to continue to move forward if we make the right investments.
Yeah, I'll jump in there and then say for sure. I think this conversation is going to be the primary conversation for the foreseeable future. And whether we see a ton of legislation that supports that thought or not, I think at least when I'm having conversations with regional partners across the state, I just had an opportunity to speak to the College and Career Academy state development board. So there's kind of statewide leadership came together in Columbus, and their conversations, I think, are really setting the table for what's coming because they are asking a broad set of questions of, with the high demand career initiative list. What are the programs we should be thinking about? How do we regionally focus on pouring individuals into the jobs that we have regionally and getting our career academies, TCSG institutions, and USG institutions ready to produce the workers for tomorrow. And we will continue to grow here in Georgia. And so what we see down in the Savannah area with Hyundai, what we see throughout North Georgia as the EV industry continues to grow. I think preparation for our citizens for the jobs that are coming will be a primary focus, not only for the governor, but also for leadership throughout the House and Senate.
Yeah, and I'll just keep going with that train of thought, Cosby. The thing that I'm excited to see starting to happen is that the sort of policy threads, I think that the folks in chamber and economic development and workforce world sort of intuitively know based upon our job. So it's the fact that these state and local policies that are in whether they're in education or early ed or literacy or on workforce development, that there's a through line to them. Like we can kind of see it, and sometimes we're able to name it and talk about what the specific solution or specific problem is. But the fact that we have legislators that are now making that connection both in their speech and in their legislation is encouraging. So I think like that ability to see, like when you have an economic development project that lands in a community, whether it's a large or small community, that there are implications for that extend not just for workforce, but for housing and for transportation and for all of these infrastructure and all of these other pieces, that it's exciting to me when you have folks who are not from that world, right? That is not their day-to-day job, come to the legislature and they're learning these things. Almost like they were a student, and so it's exciting when they're talking about it in different ways, whether they're tackling something on the pre-K side, whether they're talking about parental leave, whether they're talking about economic development and taxes, that they're making those connections and understanding that it's not just one issue, that this one issue is also connected to another, is connected to another, is connected to another. So I think that's important for the folks who are on this call to understand that there are individuals that are in positions of power in the state that are understanding those connectivity issues. For instance, if we had been talking about pre-K years ago, let's go back even like 6 years ago, and been trying to connect that to a lot of other issues from economic development to workforce, et cetera, that was not always an easy issue. That was really hard to get folks who weren't intimately connected to that particular area to understand that having childcare access is super important for workforce development. But what I saw this year is you had, Speaker Pro Tem Jones going in front of a committee that it was not, is not directly connected to that issue, talking about the need for parental leave and talking about the need for pre-K expansion. And there was an understanding among the folks on that committee that, yes, this is important. We see the connection. So I think, like, to me, that's been one of the most refreshing things to see. And we also saw it from the accelerated career and diploma and some of those other high school and career connected issues where there was just an understanding that, yes, these things belong together. So it's nice to see that recipe of policy finally come together.
Well, it sounds like we're well underway on progress, which is so exciting, because I think for so long, we've got big issues and challenges. So, in terms of kind of how Max members can get involved or get engaged, what would be the most helpful thing too for, you know, members of this group to do during the off season? I'd love for any, takeaways for our members or action items that they can go, or whether it's engaging directly with their legislator or learning more about the issues, kind of what takeaways would you give for folks that are looking to learn more or get involved? What are some best practices?
I always like to say start local. Start with what you know. Start with your own state rep and state senator, your own elected officials, and that you have those conversations there. So if there's something that's important to you, make sure you're talking about it with them so that they know that it's important to you. That is always the one. We're always our best own advocates, I say. Second to that would be if you have a policy side to the work that you do within, whether it's an association that you or your organization belongs to, whether it's Max, whoever it is, even if it's just bringing more folks into programs like these where they're hearing and talking about what's happening in workforce. I think that is the second piece of that I would say is just be curious, find out. I will say, unless you're a complete policy nerd, the legislature website is probably not where you're going to find everything that you need unless you're looking for something specific. But there are a lot of great organizations out there. Many of them have been on this particular program and are on other Max avenues. Some of them are agencies, some of them are nonprofits, and some of them are just community advocates. So I would say stay plugged in and keep listening to you, Danielle.
We're all going to keep fighting the good fight on all this. So certainly you can go to our website at the Georgia Chamber. I know the Metro Atlanta Chamber's got a lot of resources recapping this. I think Gears has a lot of great resources too, but echo Tim's thought. Any association that is involved or engaged, and if you need ideas of that, reach out to any of us and we're happy to kind of plug you in. But Cosby, would love your thoughts too on this. And I have to say, make sure you reach out to your mayor. They may all not be as good as Cosby, but
There we go. There we go. No, I could. I mean, I totally echo what you guys are saying. The only other thing that I might add is, have the solution ready. I think a lot of times, you may have an issue, and because you're on calls like this, you obviously are doing the work on the issue. And so whenever you talk to that person, if there is a certain policy ask and it is the more direct, I think the better. And it allows, I think, the legislator to go to work on it and to really know what we're looking for and what not only we're looking for as a community, but what you may be looking for in your individual communities, and starting out with educating that local rep, that local senator, and truly your locally elected officials, and allowing them to be partners alongside you. And so I couldn't say anything any different. That's perfect.
well, I so appreciate both of you being on this morning to kind of recap us, touch base. Again, if y'all want to connect with Tim or Cosby, just let us know. Happy to get you plugged in, but appreciate again y'all's time this morning, and then everything y'all do to keep things on the rails during session. That's easier said than done. So we'll just wrap up real quick here. Again, a big thank you to our anchor investors. They make all of our programming possible, and so appreciate everything that is done by these organizations in terms of their investment as well as their contributions to the bigger community. And with that, we will adjourn. Again, appreciate everyone's time. Cosby, Tim, thank you. Hope everyone has a great Friday and a great weekend. But if y'all have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks again.